Hi all, this is Dr. Reynolds. I noticed in the discussion board a number of you mentioned you would like to have a walkthrough homework problem 16 from historical linguistics. So I'm going to walk through really quickly how to reconstruct the Proto-Romance forms from the cognates we're looking at in homework problem 16. So first, the theory of language reconstruction basically says through comparative reconstruction, that which is systematic phonetic correspondences. In other words, we can look at phonetic similarities across languages to identify languages that are similar, and those languages that are systematically correspondent or share a lot of similarities phonetically um, must therefore share a common source language. Okay, so we call those words that they have in common cognates. Um, and those cognates can be different in some ways, but will be similar in ways. Um, and when they're different, they'll be different in predictable ways. We'll talk a little bit about that. And so the reconstructed common source language that we're looking for when we do comparative reconstruction, we call a proto-language. So proto-language is not a real uh, identifiable language. It is instead the recognition that languages existed in human societies long before we had any kind of way to record them. So there wasn't writing, there weren't recording machines, right? But that those languages existed, and there has to be some common source language that, if we could trace back, would be the root of the languages that are spoken today in the world. And each then family of languages, we can make certain assumptions about that proto-language, whatever that common language would have been in the past, based on comparative reconstruction. In other words, we can rebuild it through comparing related languages. Okay? So a proto-language is made up of proto-forms. It's not made up of real identifiable words because we don't know what those ancient languages, what words they actually used, right? So what we're doing is we're making our best educated hypothesis for these forms that, based on what we know about language and linguistics and our contemporary languages, are most plausible as the roots um, of the proto-language that is the common source of our contemporary languages. Okay, so the two techniques of reconstruction we're going to work with right now are phonetic plausibility strategy and majority rule strategy. Phonetic plausibility strategy says that phonetic change is typically predictable, and we know this if we go back to, remember chapter 2, we talked about articulatory processes. We know from observing human language in use that production leads to predictable articulatory processes that lead to predictable change in the use of language. We also know that some sounds are possible and some sounds are not possible, either in isolation or in combination, right? In different languages, and then by extension, when we look at comparisons in different language families, okay? The majority rule strategy is that sometimes we don't have a clear phonetically plausible way to decide which form would have been more likely to be the proto-form. And in that case, we rely on the majority. So if the majority of what we know about different examples of common languages tends to go one way, even if it is something we don't consider phonetically as plausible as some other options, we go with that majority. Why? Because when something is an exception to the rule, it actually proves that rule, right? It says, well, this is an unusual circumstance where the majority stayed in this way and resisted typical phonetic change. So we can assume that that is because it is one of the proto-forms of that language. And that's why it's persisted, because it's something from that original common source, okay? So on pages 332 to 335 in the book, It walks us through some Proto-Romance proto-forms, so you can kind of see how the process works. I'm going to walk you through the process, though, with some of the examples from problem 16 at the end of the chapter. But important things to notice, right? So notice that we begin by noting the similarities and differences among the cognates. Now, in this case, we have a limited number of cognates, so we should be aware that the conclusions we're making are also limited, right? So if you were a linguist, you would actually want to look at all the available cognates for a particular language group or family, and that would allow you to make stronger conclusions about the proto-language, right? The common language from which they spring. But the similarities can be assumed to be inherited from the proto-language as they are common among the cognates, right? And we'll talk about what that means in a minute. Once we identify the differences, then our job is to apply the reconstruction techniques to identify the most plausible phonetic root for those differences based on what we know about phonetic or articulatory processes. And there are a bunch of examples in this chapter that we also talked about it way back in chapter 2 again, right? So if phonetic explanation is not possible, then we decide based on majority. Typically, the most plausible will also be the majority because phonetic change is predictable, which we talked about way back in chapter 2. Okay, so let's look at problem 16. Here we have it. Reconstruct the Proto-Romance form for each set of cognates. Give all the changes necessary to derive each of the modern forms from the proto-forms. If you are not sure how to proceed, return to section 7, right? Obviously, section 7 is a lot of new information and a lot of new vocabulary, a lot of processes that we have not studied in depth. So I understand there was some confusion there. There's a couple of, so that note says the Spanish or Romanian spellings with the IE represent the sequence JE, which is that Y sound. And the Romanian spelling IA represents the sequence ya. And so that's just so that you recognize that the spellings and the phonetic representations are slightly different there, okay? For languages you may not be familiar with. Okay, so what does all this mean? Well, it means we have cognates from Spanish, Sardinian, and Romanian that are clearly very similar in that they take similar forms and mean the same thing, which means that we can assume that these three languages share a proto-language. In this case, we know from linguistic study that we call that language Proto-Romance. It is the proto-language of modern Romance languages. And so our job here is to figure out, well, what is most likely to have been the protoform for each of these groups of words, okay? So in other words, we look at vida, vita, vita, then what is likely to have been the root from which, or the protoform from which these forms grew, right, or developed, and then to explain how they could have developed based on what we know about language change. Okay, so we look at vita, right? So in Spanish, vida, in Sardinian, vita, in Romanian, vita. A different A sound there, you'll notice, right? So first thing we do is identify the similarities. The only similarity we have across these word forms is the E sound. And so we assume that that is part of the protoform. In other words, we know that one thing these all share in common is that E sound, and therefore that E sound is likely to be a part of our protoform. In other words, the word from which, the hypothetical word from which all of these forms derived, okay? But we have differences. So we have the option between the V or the B at the beginning of the word, right? The D or the T between the vowels in the center of the word, and the A or the A at the end of the word following the consonant, right? The final consonant. So that Romanian, the A with the A with the little shape over the top of it, is the schwa sound, okay? So then we have to decide which difference is more probable between these options we have in each position, right? So we're thinking about phonetic plausibility, and we're also thinking about majority rules. So how do we get to the idea that it is our protoform is vita? Notice we write our protoform with the asterisk ahead of it, and that's because it is a hypothetical form, right? Once again, it's not a real word. It is a hypothetical word based on what we know about language. So we decide that V is the prototypical beginning sound here. Why? Well, you could go by majority rules in this case, right? We have a 2 V's and 1 B. But you can also think about, is it more likely for a V to turn into a B sound or a B to turn into a V sound? In other words, is it more likely to strengthen or weaken a sound at the beginning of a word? Now, I understand why you might have questions about that because we haven't studied that in great detail. But at the beginning of a word, whereas in the middle of the word, we often turn stops into fricatives because it makes it easier to transition between sounds. At the beginnings of words, we often fortify those beginnings by making the initial consonant sound stronger. And so the V is more likely to become a B. But in this case, you could have guessed that based on majority rules, right? So the V would be our initial sound. We know that the E or the I, the little capital, the little lowercase I sound, or the E, is part of our protoform. So that gives our V, I, right? And then we have a T or a D. Well, once again, when we only have 3 examples, majority rules is pretty easy. So we know that the T is more likely to be there than the D based on our data sample. But in this case, we would say that it is more likely to not have a voiced consonant between 2 vowels. We don't have enough data here to demonstrate that. But voicing makes the word actually harder to say. So vita, vida, right? It changes the articulatory process. It slows it down slightly. If you actually say it, you can feel it. So I think the book expected you to make these choices based on majority rules, but to be able to recognize what is actually happening, in that case, a T to a D is a voicing of that consonant. And then finally, once again, majority rules, the sound over the sound, right? And that is a vowel reduction or centralization of the vowel, which we looked at in chapter 2 a lot. So once we've decided, in this case, we can just use majority rules to make our decisions, that VITA is our protoform. And notice that I've written them there so you can see the sound in each phonetic environment that occurs. And then in the last part, describe the sound change from the protoform that results in the cognate, right? So the T becomes the D between vowels in Spanish via voicing, right? The V becomes the B at the beginning of a word, followed by a vowel in Sardinian via strengthening, where a fricative becomes a stop. That the becomes the at the end of a word following a consonant in Romanian via vowel reduction, or the centralization of vowel sounds. Okay, let's look at another example. B is actually covered in the textbook in the same section 7. So if you want to look at that for another example or another explanation, you can do that. So let's look at C. Here in C we have Spanish riso, Sardinian ritsu, and Romanian ris. So we see here, once again, really similar word structures, right? We have the R-I-S or Z sound and the O or U sound, or the deleted final vowel sound. But they all mean life, which means that we can say, once again, that these are cognates because they share similar forms and mean the same thing. So we identify the similarities. Obviously, the R is our similarity at the beginning of the word. That R sound, which is a rolling R, is assumed to be part of the protoform. The differences then are between the E and the I, which is the difference. Once again, in this case, Romanian has a tendency to reduce vowels. And so that little caret on top of the I indicates a reduced I sound. And that occurs between the consonants, right? S or the Z between the vowels, or the vowel and end of the word, and the O or the U or the deleted final vowel following the consonant at the end of the word, okay? So then we have to decide which difference is more plausible as the protoform based on phonetic plausibility and or majority rules. Once again, they've done it in a way where you can decide based on majority rules. It makes it easier because you're not yet linguists who are fully familiar with all of the articulatory processes and which are more likely and not more likely, or less likely, right? So we can see that we also know, for example, that it is more that, for example, in chapter 2, when we talked about vowel reduction, we noted it was an articulatory process that is a change away from the standard, right? And so in the case of the E or the I sound, we know that the E sound is more likely to be plausible because vowel reduction is, we have observed that in our own study, right, as a move away from the standard form, okay, through pronunciation. So, and that's a way you can, so even if you're not familiar with enough with linguistic processes to decide about plausibility, through that example, I think you can see how that works, right? So when we have observed enough words and language change across enough examples from the same family, we can start to see how particular families tend to consistently move away from the protoform in similar ways. So one of those ways for a Romanian is in vowel reduction. Okay. But anyway, we can do it based on majority rules by itself once again. So the E sound is the standard between our consonants, right? So that gives us RI. The S rather than the Z. And in this case, one thing I wanted to point out here in the example is that so this is between vowels, right? Between the I and the O or U sound. Or between the vowel and the end of the word, because there's a deleted vowel there. So what you want to notice is that that really is the same phonetic environment. It really is vowel between vowel and vowel. And what's happened is, as part of our process, we've deleted that final vowel, right? And then the O or the U, we don't have enough information with our 3 cognates to decide whether the O or the U would be prototypical, would be above our protoform in the final vowel position. So we, in this case, would say either or is acceptable. So risu, either one is potentially a protoform, okay? So what are the actual changes? Well, in this case, it's interesting because the Spanish appears to mimic the protoform, right? Riso mimics our protoform RISO, right? The S becomes the Z in Sardinian via voicing, right? And the not only is the I reduced as a vowel, the E reduced to I, but the O or the U sound, which we don't know which it would have been, is deleted in Romanian, right, at the end, okay? All right, so D is similar and I think fairly easy to figure out. E is a good example of something that's a more challenging example and perhaps something that gave you trouble because of a lack of familiarity with some of these languages, right? Which is another challenge to linguists, right? You need to have familiarity with the languages you're working with, or at least understand phonetics strongly enough that when you're reading it as sounds and not as words, not as languages, right? So in this case, identify similarities, and potentially that's none. So one thing we can say is that there is potentially an R in that, but is it a double R or a single R? We don't know, right? So we have to decide in this case the correct form for each element of our word, right? So is the opening consonant an F or a silent sound? So the H in Spanish is actually a deleted sound, right? So we say hierro, we don't say hierro, we say hierro. Or the F for ferro, fier. Is it the IE diphthong or the E, the standard sound between the consonants? Is it the double R or the R between the vowels? Or like our last example, where we have a deleted final vowel? So we have to decide which difference is more plausible. And this one, I think, is more challenging because you may not have recognized the H and F relationship here, right? So based on majority rules, we can tell you that the F is more standard, but based on plausibility, it is more likely that something was there and is deleted than something wasn't there and was added, okay? So we say the F is the typical first sound. In this case, it appears from majority rules that the diphthong sound is more likely. The note in on your answers explain to you that that's actually an incorrect assumption because we have too limited an amount of data. It is actually it would be correct for Proto-Romance to say that it was not a diphthong, it was a monophthong, and then it is diphthongized. But in this case, based on the available information, it looks like the diphthong is the standard form, and that the regular E by itself is monophthongized, right? In other words, it's turned from a diphthong into a single sound. And then the double R appears to be more likely based on majority rules. Once again, the idea is it's more likely that there was something there that is deleted than that we actually add something. And then once again, we can't tell the difference between the O or the U as we discussed before. So what does that mean? We have to describe the result. So this F-I-E-R-R-O or U becomes in Spanish H-I-E-R-R-O, which means the F changes to a silent or is deleted, right, in the Spanish. The I-E becomes a monophthong, right, or not a diphthong, right, in Sardinian. And the double R is reduced to an R, which actually shortens the syllable of the double R. You could also call it deletion. I would be okay with that. And then the O or the U word finally is deleted again. So we can see that across Romanian, it is typical that the relationship between Romanian and the Proto-Language results in vowel reduction and in final vowel deletion and syllable shortening. And all of those are kind of related because they're more efficient forms of pronunciation. So there are other examples there, but if you have specific questions about any of those, please shoot me an email, let me know. I can never know if you have problems unless you let me know, and I'm always happy to help you. So let me know. Bye.